Hello, welcome to Straight Talk Africa, coming to you from my home in Arlington, Virginia, a suburb of Washington, D.C. I am Shaka Ssali, and today we are reflecting and analyzing the recent elections in Uganda. General Yoweri Museveni of Uganda has been elected for a sixth consecutive term to lead the country. But opposition members and international observers are raising questions whether the election was free, fair, and credible. VOA's Salim Solomon has the details.
The voting is over in Uganda's presidential election, but the fallout from the hotly contested event is still shaking the nation. The National Electoral Commission declared President Yoweri Museveni the winner with 58% of the vote on January 16. But opposition candidate Bobi Wine says the vote was marred by harassment of his supporters and ballot stuffing.
These and many other irregularities and fraudulent actions for which we have overwhelming evidence prove one thing. This has been the most fraudulent election in the history of Uganda.
Following the election, Wine was confined to his home as the military and police surrounded it for 11 days. Wine and his supporters have vowed to challenge the results in court.
We call upon the people of Uganda to reject this mockery and to refuse to acknowledge Museveni as the winner of the 14th January polls. We defeated Museveni. We defeated them. And we were supposed to be announced as winners.
The 76-year-old former rebel leader Museveni lauded the 57% of Uganda's 18 million registered voters who participated in the election. He declared it free and fair.
I therefore thank the people of Uganda, and I congratulate you for turning up in big numbers and voting for the candidates and for the parties of your choice. I think this may turn out to be the most cheating-free election since 1962.
Many international observers disagree. Both the U.S. and the European Union canceled plans to send observers to monitor the election, citing a lack of access and the threat of electoral violence. U.S. Senator Bob Menendez of New Jersey said he plans to work with the administration of President Joe Biden to respond and hold Uganda accountable for irregularities, and vowed there will be consequences for those that repeatedly engage in the willful subversion of democracy. But Ugandan Electoral Commission authorities said they gave everyone a chance to monitor results in a fair manner.
We gave them that chance to go and do observation. We are yet to know exactly what reasons the Americans have, and EU. EU was the first one to be accredited. Actually, they were accredited. So we are yet to find out what reasons they have for not wanting to participate in this exercise.
Pat Thanker of the Economist Intelligence Unit said Museveni's government went to great lengths to silence the opposition, and that is evidence that they believe Wine presents a serious threat to his rule.
In fact, you could say he turned the lopsided political environment on its head. And he's actually started something that cannot be reversed. He's opened a Pandora's box that needed to be opened.
But Museveni's supporters say the country's economy has improved under his leadership, and the president has prioritized infrastructural progress. The country's GDP grew by an average of 6.7% prior to the global pandemic in the span of 3 years, and Museveni has also been commended for how he has led efforts in battling the virus. He's also been commended for the country's open-door policy toward refugees.
Expectation from President Museveni, first of all, is security, has done a good. The second of it is going to finish up the roads which has been constructing, the hospitals, education. Is going to do more what I'm expecting to him.
Uganda is one of the youngest countries in the world with a median age of 16, but more than half of the young people of working age are unemployed. Observers see this as a volatile combination.
Young people see Museveni as the face of an out-of-touch dictator. unable to meet the needs of the country's massive unemployed workforce. It is stuck in a downward spiral of declining governance, poor economic management, and increasing local insecurity.
Thankar believes Museveni and his advisors are well aware of youth unrest, which is why the country ordered an internet shutdown for approximately 100 hours before and after the election.
Government's recent actions, shutting down the internet, the very aggressive, harsh response to protests, any opposition, any voice of an opposition in any form, media shutdown, lockdown of social media, television, radio, they've actually laid the groundwork for future civil conflict.
Some have speculated that Museveni is paving the way for his son, a commander of the country's special forces, to succeed him. But growing voices among young opposition figures are calling for change.
He said his first act of kindness and love for this country was to go to the bush and fight for our freedom, the Ugandans. At the time I was 6 years old, in '86. My opinion would have been that the next best act of kindness is to hand over power peacefully.
Meanwhile, the opposition's whine vows to press the cause in the international arena while calling on Ugandans to continue to protest the election results. Salim Solomon, VOA News, Washington.
Joining me from the Ugandan capital, Kampala, is Ms. Sarah Bireete, Executive Director of the Center for Constitutional Governance in Uganda, and Dr. Moses Khisa, Assistant Professor of Political Science and Africana Studies at the North Carolina State University. He joins us from Raleigh, the state capital. Well, I have to say that Sarah and Moses, I am profoundly honored and exceedingly humbled to have the opportunity to host you on this special edition of Straight Talk Africa.
Thank you, Shaka.
Thank you, Shaka.
Yeah.
It's a pleasure.
You're most welcome. Now let's go to Sarah, because she happens to really have the vantage point. Sarah, what is the mood like in the Ugandan capital, Kampala, given the recent elections?
Well, there's a temporary calmness in Kampala, but I think majority citizens are traumatized. But given the presence of security forces on the roads, armed and patrolling Kampala and the neighboring towns all day through, all night through, so I think there's enough intimidation that has created that temporary calmness. But I would not say that Kampala is stable.
Sarah, exactly what do you mean by saying that people are calm but traumatized?
Well, given the process of the elections, the whole violent campaign trail that Ugandans witnessed, given the acts of security agencies like kidnaps and arrests, a lot of people continue to go missing from their homes in the middle of the night, especially supporters of Honorable Robert Kyagulanyi, also known as Bobi Wine. Young people are still being kidnapped. Young people are detained in unknown centers. Their families have not been able to access them. They are detained beyond the constitutional mandate of 48 hours. Honorable Kyagulanyi said that 176 of his agencies are in detention, and some majority have not been produced in court within the constitution of 48 hours. Many people died during the campaign, and their families are mourning, and they are still traumatized. We saw shootings of people, arrests of presidential campaigns, unprecedented arrests. I know that largely in Uganda, it has become like part of tradition that in every election, some candidates get arrested. President Museveni was arrested once in 1980, but only once. Kawanga Semogere got arrested, but also once. But we have seen situations like Honorable Patrick Amuliat, who has been arrested and tear-gassed 43 times in 2 months campaign. We have seen detentions of Bobi Wine that have been followed by violent protests where more than 68 people were murdered on Kampala streets within 2 days. So this is the nature of the campaign that Ugandans have witnessed. I know that largely voting day was calm, but I would not say that it was peaceful. As civil society organizations observing elections, fully accredited by the Electoral Commission, our colleagues were arrested from Hotel Africana immediately after we issued the first statement showing the world how the voting exercise opened in Uganda. We issued our statement at 2 p.m. and by 3 p.m., 3 civil society leaders were detained together with 26 data clerks that were working in the Domestic Election Observer Data Center, tabulating information from the field from the other election observers. So I wouldn't say that there is peace or there was peace in Kampala during election with such acts. In our preliminary statement, we had information of killings in Irira and Tororo and violence in Komansimbi, among others. But because there was internet shutdown, there was little communication of what was happening in the field. We shall be releasing our preliminary statement from the Domestic Election Observer Mission. I hope that the security agencies will not arrest us immediately after issuing or as we issue the statement, because that is the mood in Kampala. But also, Shaka, it is important to note that immediately after our accreditation as domestic election observers, the National NGO Bureau, together with the Financial Intelligence Authority, did freeze. First, they banned our coalition for domestic election observers, the National Elections Watch Uganda, abbreviated as NUU, because the state thought that we were connected to the campaign slogan of Bobi Wine of a new Uganda.
But to be honest with you, listening to you, Sarah, are you talking like an executive director of an independent NGO, the Center for Constitutional Governance in Uganda, or are you talking like a partisan, somebody that had someone in the game that was supporting?
Shaka, the events that have happened to civil society, especially during this election, and some of which I have not yet talked about, these are factual things that have happened that I am talking about as an independent NGO accredited to observe elections. I have not brought in any analysis. I'm just giving a factual situation.
I see. Now, Moses.
Yes, sir.
Ndugu Moses, to be honest with you, listening to Sarah, one would in fact think that she's not talking about the aftermath of an election, but rather after perhaps the end of a military political operation. How do you respond to that?
It's tragic. And that is the reality of what we've been having in Uganda, not only this year or last year, but for a long time. The events and happenings that Sarah has just recounted have accelerated, of course, and worsened, with time, but they are not entirely new. We have been there before. We know that in 2001, when Dr. Khisa Besigye first challenged Mr. Museveni for the presidency of Uganda, he, Dr. Besigye, and his supporters were met with violence. They were, brutalized by state agents and state agencies, including those charged with keeping law and order, like the police, the Internal Security Organization, the Chieftains of Military Intelligence. Shaka, I believe you recall that in 2001, the military shot at supporters of Dr. Khisa in Rukunjiri and killed and injured people there. Election violence in 2006 was such a big issue. So many people were killed across the country, especially on polling day. 2006 was quite violent. 2011 was not very, very violent, but we know that in the aftermath of the election, with walk to work, there were all sorts of violent confrontations in Kampala. I remember going to Kampala around May, June of 2011, and I could see a city and a country that looked like it was at war with itself. The military deployments, the police presence everywhere around Kampala was simply unbelievable. And so, 2016, same thing, 2020, 21, same thing. What does this tell us? It tells us that actually we do not have the right environment, the conditions and circumstances for conducting an electoral process in Uganda. And I think as a country, and I'm speaking as a Ugandan, not as an academic, we need to go back to the drawing board and revisit the atmosphere and to rewrite the rules and have some kind of minimum agreement, minimum consensus on how an electoral process is handled in a manner that is, prudent and that makes sense for the nation.
If what you are saying is correct, Moses, then how come every 5 years you have what is called periodic elections in Uganda? You have opposition political candidates running in an event, though, given the kind of explanation you have given us regarding the conditions, they are not sincerely in a position to compete.
Well, you see, Shaka, it's become a routine ritual, but a ritual which, quite frankly, is meaningless, because we know, particularly for the presidential election, that the outcome is a foregone conclusion. We know that an election in which Mr. Museveni is a candidate is not a free and fair competition. It is an election that is already predetermined and fixed on his behalf. Why? Because the election management body, the Electoral Commission, is neither independent nor competent nor credible to adjudicate a process of competition that would lead to an outcome that is credible and that is acceptable to all the actors. But also, the entire state apparatus in Uganda is skewed against those competing with Mr. Museveni in the election. And so, the whole electioneering process, actually, to me, is something that needs to be put aside and a new, modus operandi rethought and put on the table. Because you see, we cannot have these kinds of activities around electioneering which really create more problems than they actually solve. Now, the opposition parties and opposition leaders compete with Museveni in an election that is predetermined because they have to do so. If they boycotted, it would be suicidal. You boycott and then you hand Museveni a free ticket, to remain in power. Their participation is important for testing, the system and to keep mobilizing the public and the population to demand for better. But I think we've reached a point where we really need to back up and ask ourselves, are we doing the right thing? Does this make sense? Can't we have a new consensus around how national elections are conducted in a manner that makes sense and in a manner that is productive?
Sarah, you live in Uganda.
Yes, I do.
So surely you are in a position to speak authoritatively. To what extent would you agree with some of the observations that Professor Moses Khisa has shared with us?
Well, Shaka, an election is determined by four things: inclusiveness, competitiveness, accountability, and citizens' participation. If you used the four parameters to score the just concluded elections in Uganda, you would not go beyond 30%. So what does that say then? It just confirms what Moses has said, that we need another name to define the exercise that takes place in Uganda every 5 years, because it falls far short of what is expected in an election or what is defined in our constitution as credible, free and fair regular elections. Out of the four descriptions in the constitution, the Museveni regime only meets one description of regular. So credible, free and fair is lacking in Uganda elections since independence.
So, Sarah, if you mean what you say, can you explain to me why opposition candidates continue to participate given the type of conditions that both of you have described? Because when you look at that participation, isn't it possible that basically all that participation does is legitimize the process in which an election, and some would say a selection, has been held, and General Yoweri Museveni Tibuhaburwa is declared the winner?
Going by our history then, and I will refer to the elections that were meant for a referendum on a return to multi-party politics. Opposition did boycott that referendum, but we all know how participants came in, led by the now Ambassador Nelson Ochegere and other people that were planted by the regime to participate on the other side that opposition had boycotted, to disguise the boycott. We also know that the 11 candidates that have participated in the just concluded elections, a number of them, up to the number of 5, could have been sponsored by the regime, so that in the event of the boycott by the main opposition, then there are people to contest alongside President Museveni. That's one reason why I think the opposition keeps participating in elections. But the second fundamental reason, as a civic actor, why I think opposition should still participate in these elections. Elections are the biggest platform for political mobilization. So if you boycott as an opposition leader in our pseudo-democracy, or I don't know what name to use, then you even miss a chance to keep your connection with your support base and to continuously mobilize a political base in case an opportunity for change happens. But do Ugandans expect change through the ballot? I do not think so. I think we have lost hope in attaining change in Uganda through the ballot.
Shaka, can I just chip in, for a second on that? I entirely agree with what Sarah was saying. The political boycott of elections in Africa, maybe even elsewhere, is suicidal. As a political party and as a political leader, you don't boycott an election, because when you do that, it hurts you.
What do you mean? What do you mean? What do you mean participating in such an event is suicidal?
It's suicidal.
When clearly you have the empirical evidence that the event you are about to participate in is not free, fair, transparent, verifiable, and likely to be credible.
It is suicidal, Shaka, because boycott needs to be coordinated and needs to be, done in a manner that is effective. And coordinating effective boycott is not easy. It means that everybody else who disagrees with, for example, Museveni would have to boycott the election. And if you're not able to achieve a significant, appeal of, the public and, those who want change to boycott with you, then you might end up being isolated and being irrelevant. So it is suicidal in the sense that, boycotts actually tend to fail when it comes to elections. You see, you boycott and you pretty much become irrelevant because you, put yourself out of the process and relegate yourself to the sidelines, and the others will go on.
You participate and you still remain politically irrelevant.
When you participate, there is a chance that you could use that participation for an outcome that you're looking for. You participate knowing that the process in which you are participating is flawed. It is, riddled with problems, but nevertheless, you want to use the opportunity, you want to use the platform to mobilize, to rally the public, and to expose, the excesses of the system. So, it's a double-edged sword, Shaka. You participate, you are down. You boycott, you are even more down.
Sarah, teach me a little bit about civics as far as the elections in Uganda are concerned. Who are these? If you were to talk to me, Sarah, from the deepest, better part of the bottom of your Ugandan heart and soul, who are these elections organized and meant for? Are they organized and meant for the primary stakeholders, the Ugandans, or are they, in fact, as some people have suggested, organized perhaps for the development partners, the donor community?
They are largely organized to legitimize the continued stay of President Museveni in power and to give him a clout that he is a democratic leader as he passes off or as he postures on the world stage. So can President Museveni, for example, manage to suspend elections? Like any other modern dictator, he cannot. We held these elections in the middle of the COVID pandemic. Many scholars, opinion leaders, and parliament called for the postponement of elections because in the COVID pandemic, public gatherings put at risk the lives of people. And you cannot hold elections without public gatherings, because one of the parameters of an election is freedom of expression and freedom of association. So the COVID pandemic could not enable freedom of association and expression to effectively take place. And we did call for a postponement of elections. And our constitution has provisions for a postponement of elections subject to a declaration of a state of emergency. But the president knew that his term cannot be automatically extended in our constitution because it is 5 years entrenched. It can only be extended in a referendum. So the postponement of an election would mean that there would be a discussion on whether President Museveni should remain a president of Uganda beyond May 12th without elections. And he never wanted that to happen. In the event that the president cannot and his term has ended, a speaker should assume the presidency. But President Museveni cannot allow such a situation to happen. So he had to force elections through a pandemic because he's the biggest beneficiary. And he has state resources at his disposal. He has been in power for 35 years. He does not need rallies the way Honorable Chagulanyi or Honorable Patrick Amuriat need to market themselves to the population. So the COVID pandemic was a political advantage to the regime. So that's why elections must take place in Uganda, especially if you have a dictator passing off as a democrat in power and who needs legitimacy. claim that he's serving because the people want him to serve.
What about you, Professor Moses Khisa?
Well, since the end of the Cold War, Shaka, elections have become a universal practice around the world. And so, authoritarian rulers like Mr. Museveni have no choice but to play by the rule book of the international norm and practice of conducting regular and routine, elections. So in that context, looked at from the global perspective, it's not just a Ugandan thing. Elections are now everywhere, whether they mean anything or not. Just about every country on the earth today does conduct elections of one form or the other, unless, of course, you are, I don't know, North Korea or something like that. And so, but I think Museveni also needs to put up the appearance of being a Democrat. And after all, he claims to be the most democratic person, in the world. There was a time when he said Uganda is the most democratic country in the world. He said that. And so he wants to, keep up with that smoke screen and that appearance of being a Democrat who conducts elections. And he's not going to allow any kind of postponement or any suggestion that elections shouldn't take place, because they give him the platform to showcase himself as a Democrat. And so he has a big vested interest in elections taking place, even when he knows that those elections are not about competing for power with him. They are about, certifying and giving a stamp of approval to his continued stay in power. For the average Ugandan, of course, elections, Ugandans, I think, can do better without having a presidential election. Some of us who have criticized Mr. Museveni for a long time have actually challenged him to rule by decree, to declare that he is life president, like, what General Idi Amin did, such that, he can save us the motions of elections that don't make any sense. So he can rule the way he wants as a military dictator. After all, Mr. Museveni's power, Shaka, does not come from the ballot. It comes from the bullet.
Time is not our best ally. You're watching Straight Talk Africa. We'll be right back with you. So please, don't go away.
Health, wellness, sport, beauty, medical breakthroughs. Healthy Living cares about your well-being. What are the main health concerns in Africa and around the world? Find out the latest on coronavirus. Connect with our experts and ask them questions.
How long does the virus stay?
Join me, Linor Mudu, in Washington, every week on Healthy Living, right here on VOA.
You're welcome back to Straight Talk Africa, and today we are reflecting on the recent elections in Uganda. My guests are Sarah Bireete, Executive Director of the Center for Constitutional Governance in Uganda, and Dr. Moses Khisa, Assistant Professor of Political Science and Africana Studies at the North Carolina State University. He joins us from Raleigh, the state capital. In fairness to General Yoweri Museveni Tibuhaburwa, he has actually said the reason he's been ruling Uganda for that long is not because he really would like to be president of Uganda, but rather that he and his family, in fact, are sacrificing a lot for Uganda. That he basically rules Uganda precisely because Ugandans love him. Ugandans cannot do without him. And every 5 years, we have elections in Uganda, obviously, which are called periodic elections, and the winner is in no doubt.
It's a self-serving argument, Shaka, of course, you know it. Museveni has this exaggerated view about himself as a messiah who is on mission to liberate not just Uganda, but Africa. But we know it is a deluded, mind about his own role as a liberator. We know that he is in power because he wants power, and has always been after power ever since he was a young man, as a university student. His thirst for power has everything to do with him wanting to be a ruler, not him wanting to serve Uganda and liberate Ugandans as he claims. And so, that self-serving argument about him, wanting to be president because Ugandans need him is to me ludicrous. If indeed Ugandans need him, why can't Mr. Museveni allow for free and fair competition? So he's challenged on a platform that is leveled in an environment where competition is free for all, and then we see whether Ugandans indeed want him to continue being their savior, their messiah, their liberator, and so on and so forth. How come that he has to keep such a firm grip on the coercive and financial arsenal of the state for him to keep being in power? Why?
Do you agree with some critics who have suggested that the Ugandan president perhaps suffers from a disease of having a pathological fear of fair competition? And that's the reason he likes to compete in elections where his opponents' hands are tied behind their backs and their feet tied together?
Definitely, I believe that Museveni fears competition. The only election where Museveni participated in and he wasn't in charge was in 1980, and he lost that fair and square. Since then, he has made sure that he participates in an election where he is the one in charge, where he is the one who appoints those who manage and process the election.
What the professor is saying is true. Then it probably suggests that in Uganda there are no citizens, that in Uganda we are looking at subjects. We are looking at subjects who do not have constitutional rights because they owe an allegiance to an individual authority. You can call him, for example, a presidential monarch. You can call him a king, an emperor. But the last time I checked, I thought that Ugandans are citizens who owe allegiance to the state. And therefore they basically they have constitutional rights and should be able to decide very often who should be able to govern them. How do you react to that, Sarah?
Well, Shaka, Uganda has been through a constitutional crisis for some time. I think the only difference why it's not very visible is because of the military that holds the state and the full dictatorship, which masquerades or packages itself as a democracy in the eyes of the world. But Ugandan citizens or subjects, when you go to the constitutional rights and obligations of citizens, I think you would be justified to call them subjects because President Museveni does not derive his authority from the constitution. He derives his authority from the military that brought him into power and is still keeping him in power. So he uses the people and the constitution in his journey to package his military leadership as a democracy. Is Uganda able then to redeem, or can Ugandans redeem themselves? The current talk among Ugandans is that we are in a struggle to reclaim our country. The military dictatorship, the state capture by President Museveni and the security forces has forced citizens into regular talk and practice of trying to get out of the state capture and military dictatorship of President Museveni. I wouldn't even call it a constitutional monarch, because a constitutional monarch respects the principles and objectives of the constitution. What it takes away is the choice of the people on who should govern them. But in Uganda, Ugandans do not have the choice, as enshrined in Article 1 of the Constitution, as to who should govern them in regular, free and fair, credible elections, because such elections do not exist. Therefore, that power does not exist.
What you are saying is that the result of the recent elections in Uganda were reflections not of the individuals who actually voted, or were not the reflections of the will of the people, but rather the will of the individual who announced the results. Is that what you are saying?
That's what I'm saying. And even Shaka to add, in these elections, the results read showed a big number of invalid votes. Daily Monitor did a sample study in Zimbabwe and discovered that the cast votes were more than registered voters. And when the returning officer realized that during the district study, he decided to consider the excess votes beyond the registered voters as invalid votes. And I think this repeated itself in many districts. And that's why we have so many invalid votes, as if Ugandans do not know how to cast their votes.
If Sarah is correct, Professor Khisa, then how come Ugandans have not, or I'm not seeing Ugandans demanding the authentic results of the last elections? I ask this because the last time I checked, Uganda is a republic. It is neither a kingdom nor a monarchy. And therefore, I would hope that Ugandans, as a people, individually, have a right to own an opinion, however different it may be from that of the ruling party.
That's true. We don't know what's going to happen going forward. Definitely, Ugandans in different ways have been demanding that the results of the election are announced as the authentic results. We definitely have seen a lot of, calls coming from different, sections of Ugandans, especially the political leadership and other Ugandans, lay Ugandans, insisting that there is transparency and that there is fairness in the process, of the elections. But Shaka, if I may just back up a little bit and say that, so what Sarah was describing there speaks to the core of the problem, which is that you cannot have an election that is credible and acceptable until the process is properly managed and handled. Until you have an election management body that is both competent and independent. It's competent because it has the right people in place who are managing it, appointed on merit and given all the resources with which to operate, but also independent in the sense that they are not under the undue influence of any particular actor, particularly the incumbent. Now, in the case of the current Electoral Commission in Uganda, we know that the different actors, the different political parties, especially opposition parties, have always had objections on the composition and constitution of the Electoral Commission. The person heading it, Justice Simon Byabakama, has his own history that many people do not find acceptable. He has previously, been involved in certain things that make him not beyond reproach in terms of his credibility and his credentials. And so until the issue of who the umpire is, how that umpire comes about, how competent and credible that umpire is, an outcome of an election like that in Uganda is going to be contested. The losing side, which is most likely going to be the opposition, will query and complain about, how the results were tallied, how the results were processed, and how the results were announced. And so for a long time, activists and advocates of reform in Uganda have insisted that there is a need for electoral reforms, such that you have the right set of rules in place, such that you have the right institutional mechanisms in place, which will guarantee you that when the process is being managed, it is a credible process whose outcome will be acceptable, because the outcome is going to depend on the process, and the process depends on who is managing that process and how credible and competent those people who are in charge of the process are.
Given the conditions that have obtained in Uganda, and I'm talking about electoral conditions since 1996, given those type of conditions, a great man that you would know of, Professor Albert Einstein, the man who came up with the theory of relativity, the man that is a recipient of the Nobel Prize in physics, the man that had a great mind. He once said that if you continue doing the same thing over and over again, that is insanity. Are we looking at political insanity in the context of Uganda here?
In some ways, yes. I mean, I wouldn't argue with that. The fact that we've been going around in circles and insisting on, conducting elections that are meaningless, we have, moved in the direction of insanity and in doing the kind of stuff that we shouldn't be doing. The problem, though, here, and Shaka, the bigger problem is that, we have a broken political system, and we have a decadent regime, a regime of Mr. Museveni that is off the wheels, and that is dysfunctional, and that is not taking us anywhere. And so there is an urgent need for change. Now, the question is, how can that change come about? That change is not going to happen through the ballot. It's not going to happen through the polling booth. That change needs to be rethought in a completely different and radical manner. But if we continue going down the path of elections, especially elections with some Museveni there, we are going around in circles, and I wouldn't argue against anybody who says we engaged in the business of insanity.
You call it a broken system, but there is incontrovertible evidence that both Ugandans, that a vast majority of Ugandans and the international community seem to support it.
Well, I don't know which Ugandans support a broken system, Shaka, but the Ugandans that I know, and I as a Ugandan, I do not believe that the current system we have is a viable and prudent system of political management, both in terms of public management generally, but also particularly in terms of the procedural arrangement of choosing leaders. When you have a system where elections cannot be managed properly in a credible and competent manner, what kind of system is that other than a broken system?
Sarah, when General Yoweri Museveni Tibuhaburwa shot his way to the Ugandan capital Kampala in 1986, and seized the power. He was celebrated by most Ugandans as a savior. What happened?
Yeah, Shaka, President Museveni did promise in his speech, maiden speech after swearing in, he did promise that his won't be a change of guts, it will be a fundamental change. And he did highlight his fundamental change under the 10 points program. Number one under the 10 points program was democracy. But do we have democracy in Uganda? 35 years in power of President Museveni, my answer is no.
In fact, as far as General Yoweri Museveni Tibuhaburwa is concerned, you indeed have and enjoy democracy. He has actually said he brought Ugandans democracy.
No, I think that what he went in the bush to replace could have been better in terms of political rights and freedoms for Ugandans than what he is offering right now. So, but if you go to the 10 points program that he promised under his package as fundamental change, he had high on the agenda issues like fighting corruption, fighting sectarianism, equitable development, among other things. So if you score him against that promise, and he even went on the Addis Ababa platform, in addition to the 10 points program, and did state that the problem of Africa, and specifically Uganda, are leaders who overstay in power. So this is the kind of Museveni that Ugandans celebrated. But what has he delivered? Or what have they harvested? They have harvested the opposite of that promise.
Sarah, you are quite correct in talking especially about how he used to be very contemptuous towards those African leaders who overstayed in power. He also once told me in an interview that he didn't like the type of rulers that Nigerians called the seat-tight presidents. But he has recently cleverly shifted the political goalposts. In fact, he recently said in interviews with some international media that when he talked against Africans who stay longer in power, he basically meant those African leaders who stayed longer in power without being elected by their people. What about that?
Yes, Shaka, it's true he has since amended his thoughts, but even going by his amended acclamation, so does Uganda have elections and is he elected? And my answer would be no, because we do not have a mechanism of quantifying what happens in elections, and he violently uses state agencies against his opponents, and he characterizes a trade of a vote for it's a banknote for a ballot. It is a trade. He goes distributing money, he goes buying voters on top of using security agencies and brutalizing his agencies. So do we have elections? Even if he wants to claim that they should stay after elections. So my view is that we do not have what qualifies to be called elections in Uganda.
Sarah, did you vote in the last election?
Shaka, in the just concluded election, I was overseeing observers. We were only 7 civil society organizations accredited to observe elections. But also in addition to that, because of COVID pandemic, the international observers that came to Uganda just arrived 2 days to elections and did not have an opportunity of observing the process. Because elections is not an event, it's a process that starts in the pre-nomination, nomination exercise, voting, and post-election exercise. So having this duty, and given that we were very few civil society organizations as compared to past elections. In the past elections, you would have up to 80 or 100 civil society organizations accredited to observe elections. We were just 7. And then on the eve of voting, we were denied accreditation tags to enter the National Study Center as domestic civil society observer mission. And in the absence of meaningful international observer missions in these elections. So Shaka Ssali, I voted in Bushenyi, and I was unable to travel to Bushenyi in this election, but I have always voted and I'm a registered voter.
So why have you always voted in an event that you say is not an election? And in fact, there are many, many millions of Ugandans who, like you, have been basically dutifully voting every 5 years, which is called periodic elections. Because if you participate every 5 years, surely you must believe in the legitimacy of that type of event.
Shaka, the crisis of national building. You know, the process of national building does not happen in a day. For 58 years of Uganda's democracy, we are struggling to achieve free and fair, credible elections, as well as a peaceful transition of power as a nation. And as a civic leader, I think that it's my duty, after mobilizing citizens to vote and making sure that their vote counts, I think it's also my duty to do the same, because I should practice what I preach. And we hope that one day we shall be able to achieve a normal country, but it's a concerted, long process, and we are not about to give up because we do not have any other countries to call our own.
Professor, you have the last word.
Sure. Shaka, I think that, you know, the world obviously has come a long way in terms of rejecting rulers who come to power through the force of arms, military coups, and armed rebellion. In fact, the African Union, to its credit, has taken some very significant steps in that direction by, you know, having provisions in the African Charter on Human Rights, Democracy, and Governance that, you know, sanctions individuals who undertake coups. There's actually a provision within the African Union legal framework to also take measures against rulers who refuse to leave power after losing elections. That has not been implemented as strongly and as aggressively as it should. And I think it's something that needs to be done going forward, that the international community working with you know, domestic actors should take a stance against, you know, violations of due process that lead to election outcomes that are in practice another form of coup. So people like Museveni actually do not need to do the old type coup. They do a coup by rigging elections.
Well, Professor Khisa and Bireete, I have to say it was a pleasure interacting with you.
It was a pleasure too, Shaka. Thank you.
You're most welcome.
Thank you very much, Ndugu.
Thanks to our audience for joining our conversation on Straight Talk Africa. In the meantime, get better, not bitter, Uganda. And please, please, let's keep the African hopes alive.